aus der BR24-Redaktion. Wir schauen aufs Klima, auf den Bericht des Weltklimarats IPCC. Der wird jetzt vorgestellt in einer internationalen Pressekonferenz. Wie steht es ums Klima, um die Erderwärmung und welche Chancen gibt es noch im Kampf dagegen? Das hören wir jetzt und ordnen das Ganze danach dann hier für euch ein. Bis später.
Climate change impacts, adaptation and vulnerability. We will be also presenting the scientific findings related to it. We have several distinguished speakers today. Their brief statements will be followed by the official presentation of the report. I'll start just with a few words about the running of the press conference. The instructions on how to submit questions have already been shared with the IPCC accredited media yesterday and again this morning. When submitting your questions, please do indicate your name, your media organization, and to whom your question is directed to. We will try to accommodate as many questions as possible, but due to high level of media interest, we may simply not be able to address them all. We are scheduled to wrap up this press conference by 1:30 p.m. Central European Time. I'm pleased now to welcome the Secretary of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, Mr. Abdallah Moqsit, who will introduce today's speakers.
Thank you all for joining us today for the release of this important report. This IPCC report on impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability to climate change follows the report on the physical science basis we launched in August 2021. It also comes before the two last reports which we expect this year. With this report, we will conclude the sixth assessment report of the IPCC, the most intense in the history of IPCC. We have successfully completed the second ever IPCC virtual approval session, and I wish to express my deep appreciation to the scientists working on a voluntary basis, the governments, observers organization, and everyone else who contributed to this report. The IPCC is a unique interface between policy and science, and that's what makes our reports the most credible resource on climate change for decision makers at all levels. I am incredibly honored to welcome and introduce our distinguished guest speakers. First, we will see the video message from the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres. Today, we will also hear from our chair, the IPCC chair, Professor Hussolli, and the two heads of our parent organizations. The World Meteorological Organization Secretary General, Professor Petri Talas, and the United Environment Program Executive Director, Dr. Inger Andersen. We also have the two co-chairs who led the production of the reports, Dr. Deborah Roberts and Dr. Hans-Otto Portner. We will now see the video message from the United Nations Secretary General, Antonio Guterres.
Dear representatives of the media, I've seen many scientific reports in my time, but nothing like this. Today's IPCC report is an atlas of human suffering and a damning indictment of failed climate leadership. With fact upon fact, this report reveals how people on the planet are getting clobbered by climate change. Nearly half of humanity is living in the danger zone now. Many ecosystems are at the point of no return now. Unchecked carbon pollution is forcing the world's most vulnerable on a frog march to destruction now. The facts are undeniable. This abdication of leadership is criminal. The world's biggest polluters are guilty of arson on our only home. It is essentially to meet the goal of limiting global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. And science tells us that will require the world to cut emissions by 45% by 2030 and achieve net zero emissions of greenhouse gases by 2050. But according to current commitments, global emissions are set to increase almost 14% over the current decade. That spells catastrophe. It will destroy any chance of keeping 1.5 alive. Today's report underscores two core truths. First, coal and other fossil fuels are choking humanity. All G20 governments have agreed to stop funding coal abroad. They must now urgently do the same at home and dismantle their coal fleets. Those in the private sector still financing coal must be held to account. Oil and gas giants and their underwriters are also on notice. You cannot claim to be green while your plans and projects undermine the 2050 net zero target and ignore the major emission cuts that must occur this decade. People see through the smoke screen. OECD countries must phase out coal by 2030 and all others by 2040. The present global energy mix is broken. As current events make all too clear, our continued reliance on fossil fuels makes the global economy and energy security vulnerable to geopolitical shocks and crises. Instead of slowing down the decarbonization of the global economy, now is the time to accelerate the energy transition to a renewable energy future. Fossil fuels are a dead end for our planet, for humanity, and yes, for economies. A prompt, well-managed transition to renewables is the only pathway to energy security, universal access, and the green jobs our world needs. I'm calling for developed countries, multilateral development banks, private financiers, and others to form coalitions to help major emerging economies end the use of coal. These targeted mechanisms of support would be over and above existing sustainable development needs. The second core finding from this report is slightly better news. Investments in adaptation work. Adaptation saves lives. As climate impacts worsen, and they will, scaling up investments will be essential for survival. Adaptation and mitigation must be pursued with equal force and urgency. That is why I've been pushing to get the 50% of all climate finance for adaptation. The Glasgow commitment on adaptation funding is not enough to meet the challenges faced by nations on the front lines of the climate crisis. I'm also pressing to remove the obstacles that prevent small island states and least developed countries from getting the finance they desperately need to save lives and livelihoods. We need new eligibility systems to deal with this new reality. Delay means death. I take inspiration from all those on the front lines of the climate battle fighting back with solutions. All development banks, multilateral, regional, national, know what needs to be done. Work with governments to design pipelines of bankable adaptation projects and help them find the funding, public and private. And every country must honor the Glasgow Pledge to strengthen national climate plans every year until they are aligned with 1.5 degrees Celsius. The G20 must lead the way, or humanity will pay an even more tragic price. I know people everywhere are anxious and angry. I am too. Now is the time to turn rage into action. Every fraction of a degree matters. Every voice can make a difference, and every second counts. Thank you.
Following Secretary General's message, I now invite the chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, Dr. Hwa-Sung Lee, to take the floor.
Thank you very much. Distinguished representatives of the media, WMO Secretary General Petteri, UNEP Executive Director Anderson. We have just heard a powerful message from the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres. The findings of the IPCC report we are releasing today are clear. The stakes for our planet have never been higher. Last August, the IPCC's Working Group 1 report showed unequivocally that human activities have warmed the climate at a rate not seen in at least the past 2,000 years. We are on course to reaching global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius within the next 2 decades, and temperature will continue to rise unless the world takes much bolder action. The Working Group 2 report we are releasing today provides the latest understanding of what does this warming means for the people, ecosystems, and the planet. The report is a dire warning about the consequences of inaction. It shows that climate change is a grave and mounting threat to our well-being and a healthy planet. It also shows that our action today will shape how people able to adapt to climate change and how nature responds to increasing climate risks. Severe climate change impacts are already happening. Vulnerable people, those marginalized socially and economically, are the most exposed to climate change impacts and have the least resources to adapt. Today, we also deepen our understanding of solutions to climate change and how adaptation can help us lower risks and reduce vulnerability. These solutions open new opportunities for innovation in our societies and economies. Our collective and individual adaptation can be an effective strategy, but there are limits to how much we and other species can adapt. Beyond certain temperatures, adaptation is no longer possible for some species. Our report is a blueprint for our future on this planet. It recognizes the interdependence of climate, ecosystems, and biodiversity and people. It integrates natural, ecological, social, and economic sciences more strongly than in earlier IPCC assessments. It provides new knowledge and information at regional levels and focuses on cities where the majority of people live and opportunities for adaptation and mitigation arise. Critically, this report highlights the importance of including and using diverse forms of knowledge, such as indigenous and local knowledge. But most importantly, it emphasizes the urgency of immediate and more ambitious action to address climate risks. Half measures are no longer an action. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, for these compelling remarks. I now invite the Secretary General of the World Meteorological Organization, Petteri Talas, to take the floor.
Today we are releasing the second part of the IPCC Sixth Assessment Report. WMO is proud to be the co-hosting and founding organization of IPCC. The Physical Science Basis report was published in August. Today we are talking about already very visible impacts of climate change. The report says that climate change induced by us humans has caused widespread negative impacts to nature, people, beyond the natural climate variability. Altogether, 127 risks have been identified, covering a very wide range of sectors like health, agriculture, economy, infrastructure, and ecosystems. Our atmosphere today is on steroids, doped with fossil fuels. This is already leading to stronger, longer, and more frequent extreme weather events. Climate change-induced disasters come with high human and economic impacts. More than 4 in 10 people in the world live in contexts highly vulnerable to climate change. Global hotspots are found in parts of Africa, Southern Asia, small island developing states, and Central and South America. In many of those countries, population growth, urbanization, and unsustainable development practices are boosting the exposure of people and ecosystems to climate change. But all countries are affected, as we have seen in Germany, United States, and Canada last year. It is essential to raise the ambition level of climate mitigation. That would also have a positive impact on air quality and is vital to tackle the looming water crisis and sea level rise. Climate mitigation offers also great business opportunities in many sectors like energy, transport, industry, and nutrition. Besides mitigation, it is more and more critical to pay attention to adaptation, since the negative trend in weather extremes will anyhow continue for the coming decades, and sea level rise for centuries due to the record high concentration of carbon dioxide. One of the powerful ways to adapt is to invest in early warning services. But the basic weather and climate observing networks have severe gaps in Africa and island states. Only half of the 193 members of WMO have proper weather, climate and hydrological services. This leads to higher human and economic losses. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Secretary General Thalas, for these important remarks. I now invite Inge Andersen, the Executive Director of UNEP, United Nations Environment Programme, to take the floor.
Thank you so much. And to you, Professor Hoo-Sung Lee, to you, Petri, my colleague, of course, to Abdallah Moqsid, Secretary of IPCC, and to the co-chairs, Dr. Deborah Roberts and Dr. Hans Otto Portner, and to the amazing and formidable IPCC scientific community and friends, greetings from Nairobi. We are in the midst of United Nations Environment Assembly, which gathers here to look at environmental issues. And this report comes at a time of great turmoil, when we need strong multilateralism to promote peace and healthy environment. And the message this report sends is clear. Climate change isn't lurking around the corner waiting to pounce. It's already upon us, raining down blows on billions of people. We're seeing dangerous disruption across the natural world. Species are migrating in search of more livable conditions. In climate risk hotspots, deaths from floods, droughts, or storms were 15 times higher than those in more resilient countries over the last decade. This is climate injustice, particularly for indigenous people and local communities. And all of this and more at only 1.1 degrees Celsius of global warming. Even if we limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, the blows will come harder and faster. As things stand, we're heading to closer to 3 degrees Celsius. We are in an emergency heading for a disaster. We can't keep taking these hits and treating the wounds. Soon those wounds would be too deep, too catastrophic to heal. We need to soften and slow the blows by cutting greenhouse gas emissions, but we also need to cushion the blows by picking up our efforts to adapt to climate change, which have been too weak for too long. The best way to do this is to let nature do the job it spends millions of years perfecting, absorbing and channeling rainwater and surging waves, maintaining biodiversity and balance in the soils so that diverse plants can grow, providing cooling shade under leafy canopies. We need large-scale ecosystem restoration from ocean to mountaintop, including through agreeing to start negotiations on the Global Plastic Pollution Agreement here in Nairobi at the 5th United Nations Environment Assembly. We need to bring nature into baking hot cities to keep them cool. We need to conserve mangroves, coral reefs, and other nature's defenses. We need to protect and restore wetlands for nature and incorporate wetlands into our cities. Backing nature is the best way to adapt to and to slow climate change while providing jobs and boosting economies. We must start dedicating thought and funding to transformational adaptation programs with nature at their heart. Humanity has spent centuries treating nature like its worst enemy. The truth is that nature can be our savior, but only if we save it first. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Andersen, for these thoughtful remarks. We will now hear the presentation of the report's findings from the co-chairs of the Working Group 2, Dr. Deborah Roberts and Dr. Hans Otto Portner.
Thank you, Andre. It's indeed a great pleasure to welcome the global community to the start of a really important global conversation, where I and my fellow co-chair will present the outcomes of 5 years of hard work by the global scientific community. So welcome everyone around the world. Can we bring up the presentation, please? Firstly, thank you to everyone for joining us, and certainly as the co-chairs of Working Group 2, and on behalf of our authors, we are very proud to present this latest report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which focuses on climate change impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability. 270 authors from 67 countries have worked tirelessly to produce this report. Over the last 5 years, they have assessed 34,000 scientific papers to prepare their findings. During the review process, they considered each one of 62,418 comments from experts and governments, which have helped make the report as comprehensive and clear as possible. We would like to thank everyone who has contributed to this process. Let us now share some of the key findings which reflect our growing scientific knowledge and provide the best understanding yet of climate change impacts, risks, options to adapt, and the limits we face. Perhaps this statement best summarizes our findings. The scientific evidence is unequivocal. Climate change is a threat to human well-being and the health of the planet. Any further delay in concerted global action will miss the brief and rapidly closing window to secure a livable future. This report offers solutions to the world. And in the next 20 minutes, we will explore these with you. But let's start with the impacts.
Sorry for this technical glitch. Let's start from the beginning. Global warming of 1.1 degrees Celsius has caused dangerous and widespread disruption in nature. The increased frequency, intensity, and duration of extreme events on land and in the ocean is driving mass mortalities, for example, in trees, as we show here in this drought-stressed forest in California, USA. And climate change is affecting the lives and livelihoods of billions of people. The impacts from human-induced intensification of tropical cyclones, sea level rise, and heavy rainfall have resulted in increased losses and damages. Impacts are magnified in cities, where more than half the world's population lives. Heat waves amplify urban heat islands and air pollution to affect people's health. Critical infrastructure, such as transport, water, sanitation, and energy systems, have been compromised by extreme events.
When multiple extreme events happen at the same time, they compound the overall risk and are more difficult to manage. What we see here is an example of how heat and drought combine to cause reduction in crop yields, made worse by reduced productivity because of heat stress amongst farm workers. Reduced yields lead to reductions in household incomes, increased food prices locally and potentially globally. climate risks do not respect national boundaries, and weather-related extremes are creating shocks to global trade. In the previous slide, we illustrated the powerful impacts of climate change on nature and people's lives. In this assessment, it is based on a new understanding of these interconnections. We can no longer think in silos, but have to look across climate, biodiversity, and human society and well-being if we want to tackle the many global challenges we face today. And talking of other challenges, climate change combines with unsustainable use of natural resources, habitat destruction, deforestation, and growing urbanization, as well as inequity and marginalization. These trends not only present threats to ecosystems and the people who rely on them, but also reduce the capacities of nature, communities, and individuals to adapt to climate change. 3.3 to 3.6 billion people live in global hotspots of high vulnerability to climate change. These are across large parts of Africa, as well as South Asia, Central and South America, small islands, and the Arctic. In these global hotspots, overlapping challenges include limited access to water, sanitation, and health services, high levels of climate-sensitive livelihoods, such as smallholder farmers and fishing communities, all increase vulnerability. High levels of poverty, weak leadership, lack of funding, lack of accountability, and trust in government also play a part.
Looking to the future, every small increase in warming will result in increased risks to nature and to people in every region of the world. Here we see a bleached coral colony on a dying reef off Okinawa, Japan. Let's consider some of these projected impacts on nature. This map gives an overview of biodiversity loss at different warming levels. We would see species extinctions and losses of entire ecosystems, such as mountaintops, tropical coral reefs, and coastal wetlands, even if we temporarily exceed 1.5 degrees warming for several decades. The risk of extinction in biodiversity hotspots increases by about tenfold as warming rises from 1.5 to 3 degrees Celsius. Nature services support all aspects of our lives, from pollination and tourism to health and climate regulation. Loss of ecosystems and their services has cascading and long-term impacts on people globally, especially for indigenous peoples and local communities who directly depend on them. Globally, population exposure due to heat waves will continue to increase with additional warming. At approximately 2 degrees Celsius, regions that are highly dependent on snowmelt could experience a 20% decline in water availability for agriculture beyond 2050. And we know that climate change will undermine food security. At 2 degrees warming, by 2050, people in sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, Central and South America, and on small islands are likely to experience food shortages, leading to malnutrition. About 1 billion people living in low-lying cities and other settlements on the coast are projected to be at risk from sea level rise and other climate hazards by mid-century. We provide a global perspective here, but this report also has an extensive regional focus. We have outlined the challenges we face and how they will increase at higher warming levels. The key question now is, how well are we adapting to changing climate? What we show is that action has increased, but progress is uneven, and we are not adapting fast enough. Growing public and political awareness of climate impacts and risks has resulted in at least 170 countries and many cities, including adaptation in their climate policies and planning. However, there are increasing gaps between adaptation, action taken, and what's needed. These gaps are largest among lower income populations. At the current rate of planning and implementation, these adaptation gaps will continue to grow.
Let's now turn our attention to how we adapt. And in this report, we show that there are feasible, effective options we can take to reduce the risk to people and nature, but their effectiveness decreases with increasing warming. When we think of adaptation, our first thoughts must be around reducing flood risk or preventing water shortages. But what we show is that the strengthening of health systems can reduce the impacts of infectious diseases, heat stress, and other climate-related risks, as well as the trauma associated with extreme events. This is particularly effective if it's combined with other measures, such as disease surveillance, early warning systems, and improving access to potable water. Nature offers significant untapped potential, not only to reduce climate risks and deal with the causes of climate change, but also to improve people's lives and livelihoods. Agroforestry is a climate-resilient way of growing food and creating wildlife habitat. Here we see a Nigerian rubber farmer diversifying his business with food crops, fruit trees, and bees. Conservation, protection, and restoration can help natural forests to adapt. Planting a range of tree species, managing pests and diseases, and reducing wildfire risks can help build climate resilience in managed forests. In agriculture, irrigation can be effective, but it can also result in adverse outcomes, such as accelerated depletion of groundwater. This and other adaptation measures provide economic and ecological benefits, as well as reducing vulnerability. In urban areas and elsewhere, effective urban management can secure drinking water. Most action to date has occurred around water-related hazards, such as reducing the risks from floods and droughts. Letting nature take its course, such as restoring wetlands and rivers and creating no-build zones, can reduce flood risks. The effectiveness of most water-related adaptation declines with increasing warming.
Food security can be enhanced by making the food system more resilient. For example, through adopting stress-tolerant crops and livestock, agroforestry, and diversification on farms. Community-based adaptation that is locally driven, that respects local and indigenous knowledge systems, and is adequately resourced can also be effective. Strengthening biodiversity can improve pest control, pollination, carbon storage, and it can provide shade for temperature-sensitive crops such as coffee and cacao. This all brings a range of other benefits for nutrition, health and well-being, and livelihoods. By 2050, urban areas could be home to 2/3 of the world's population. Cities also offer opportunities to transform. Using nature and engineering approaches together is important. To manage flood risk, for example, it might be important to install floodproofing on buildings, improve drainage along roads, and create space for water within the city, at the same time as constructing flood defenses. Establishing or restoring green and blue spaces, parks, green corridors, ponds and wetlands, as well as urban agriculture can all be woven into the built environment. Social safety nets for disaster management can help people overcome the impacts of climate change and can provide financial security. All be woven into the built environment.
Und wir melden uns kurz, wir haben jetzt die Eingangsquelle gewechselt, sodass ihr jetzt auch die Charts sehen könnt. Deshalb nicht wundern, wenn jetzt ein Teil der Pressekonferenz vielleicht doppelt zu hören war. Es geht nur um wenige Sekunden und wir sind jetzt wieder live drauf.
Benefits include public health improvements, especially from reducing heat stress and ecosystem conservation. In informal settlements, we show how local knowledge, adequate funding, skills and tools, as well as policymakers and residents working together can deliver adaptation at a city scale. Accountability, transparency, and commitment from government is also most important. Here we see community sanitation facilities being built and water tanks being installed in informal settlements in India.
We have evidence of maladaptation, adaptation that results in unintended consequences. For example, increased climate-related risks or increased greenhouse gas emissions. In this photograph on the left are sea defenses that may not be strong enough to protect the people living behind them. People can be lulled into a false sense of security. Compare this to an example from Delaware in the USA of how it's possible to use nature to provide flood protection. Indigenous peoples, ethnic minorities, and disadvantaged groups, for example, low-income households and those living in informal settlements, are some of the most affected by maladaptation. This reinforces and entrenches existing inequalities. We know that there are adaptation limits. Adaptation cannot prevent all losses and damages. And even with effective adaptation, limits will be reached with higher levels of warming. Some natural solutions will no longer work above 1.5 degrees Celsius warming. Above 1.5 degrees Celsius, a lack of fresh water could mean that people living on small islands and those dependent on glaciers and snowmelt can no longer adapt. And by 2 degrees Celsius, it may be especially challenging to farm multiple staple crops in many current growing areas, particularly in tropical regions. If we focus on financial constraints, we see that current global financial flows are insufficient, especially in developing countries. The overwhelming majority of global tracked climate finance was targeted at emission reductions, while a small portion went on adaptation. Climate impacts that result in higher levels of losses and damages also slow down economic growth and thus reduce the availability of financial resources.
To avoid mounting losses, urgent action is required to adapt to climate change. But that's not enough. At the same time, it is essential to make rapid, deep cuts in greenhouse gas emissions to keep the maximum number of adaptation options open. So how do we accelerate and sustain adaptation? Political commitment and follow-through across all levels of government is key. Greater adaptation is present where national climate laws and policies require adaptation action from lower levels of government and include guidelines on how to do this. Another area worth focusing on is institutional frameworks with clear goals and priorities that define responsibilities. These frameworks can impose duties upon governments to implement adaptation actions, for example, around conservation, sustainable use of beaches, urban development, and targeting diseases exacerbated by climate change. Enhancing knowledge of impacts, risks, and available adaptation options encourages actions from society and policymakers. Educational and information programs and the arts can play a part. Monitoring and evaluation is important to track progress because in a warming world, measures that are effective now might not work in 20 years. Adaptation strategies might have to be revised constantly. Revisions should be fact and data-driven. And finally, inclusive governance that prioritizes equity and justice is also important. Citizens, civil society organizations should participate directly in planning and decision-making. It's important to highlight that adaptation measures offer wider benefits. If we consider that 3.4 billion people living in rural areas, many of whom are highly vulnerable to climate change, resilience can be improved by providing social safety nets, improved roads, reliable energy, clean water, and improved food security. These measures not only build climate resilience, but they also go hand in hand with helping to lift people out of poverty and achieving the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal 1. These other simple examples demonstrate how different goals may be achieved in a variety of circumstances. In this report, we have looked at these synergies in some depth. And this is how we illustrate the multiple benefits of adaptation options. If you look at this figure, you see forest-based adaptation. It shows that it is a feasible adaptation option that will also help absorb and store carbon. So it has mitigation potential, and it helps achieve multiple sustainable development goals marked here with a plus. Likewise, if we look at options in our cities, we see that green infrastructure, green roofs, parks, and street trees play a part in helping us adapt by providing shade and water management. They also absorb and store carbon. Again, they help with multiple UN goals. What we see here is the foundation for a solutions framework that is an important new concept in this report. Let's explore this now. If we look at this figure, we see a spectrum of futures, from a world with low resilience and high risk to one with high resilience and low risk. This high resilience, low risk future and world has reduced climate risks through adaptation, reduced greenhouse gas emissions through mitigation, and enhanced biodiversity. These measures together support sustainable development, for example, no poverty, zero hunger, good health and well-being, and access to clean water and sanitation. This concept is climate resilient development.
Climate resilient development has to be considered across government and all of civil society. It should involve everyone, round the table, governments, citizens, communities, educational institutions, the media, investors, and businesses forming partnerships. Scientific, indigenous, and local knowledge and practical know-how come together to provide more relevant, effective options. Ecosystem stewardship is key. A healthy planet is fundamental to climate resilient development. Effective and equitable conservation of approximately 30 to 50% of land, freshwater systems, and oceans can help ensure a healthy planet. Involving traditionally marginalized groups, including women, young people, indigenous peoples, local communities, and ethnic minorities, improves the prospects for effective action. It is critical to prioritize equity and justice in decision-making and investment. Different interests, values, and worldviews can be reconciled if everyone works together. Scaled up investment and international cooperation are also important. Starting today, every action, every choice, and every decision matters, because each of them can take us away from or towards a climate resilient, sustainable world. Worldwide action to achieve climate resilient and sustainable development is more urgent than previously assessed.
Climate resilient development is already challenging at current global warming levels. The prospects will be further limited if global warming exceeds 1.5 degrees Celsius, and may not be possible in some regions, including small islands, deserts, mountains, and polar regions if warming exceeds 2 degrees Celsius. The science is clear. Any further delay in concerted global action will miss a brief and rapidly closing window to secure a livable future. This report offers solutions to the world. This presentation has given you a snapshot of a wide range of topics that are covered in depth in this report. It's over to you now. Thank you.
Mehr als 3 Milliarden Menschen sind schon jetzt von den Folgen des Klimawandels bedroht. So nur einer der vielen Inhalte aus dem Bericht des Weltklimarats IPCC, den wir da gerade gehört haben, der gerade vorgestellt wurde. Wir wollen die wichtigsten Infos jetzt daraus aus dem Bericht und dieser Pressekonferenz noch einmal für euch zusammenfassen. Ich hole dafür mal meinen Kollegen dazu, nämlich BR-Reporter Tobias Beetz aus unserer Redaktion Landwirtschaft und Umwelt. Hallo Tobias.
Hallo.
Tobias, worum ging es jetzt in diesem neuen IPCC-Bericht, den wir da gerade vorgestellt bekommen haben?
Also um so zusammenzufassen, der Klimabericht, der besteht im Grunde aus 3 Teilen. Den ersten Teil, den haben wir schon letztes Jahr gehört, da ging es um die wissenschaftlichen Grundlagen des Klimawandels. Jetzt heute wird der zweite Teil eben vorgestellt. Der ist doch deutlich konkreter. Er geht direkt auf den Einfluss des Klimawandels auf Mensch, Natur, Biodiversität ein. Und interessant ist, dass auch die soziale Komponente da eine große Berücksichtigung geführt hat. Also wie wirkt sich zum Beispiel auch soziale Ungleichheit aus im Zusammenhang mit dem Klimawandel. Also der Bericht, dieser Teilbericht geht vielmehr dieser Frage nach, wie betrifft mich tatsächlich jetzt der Klimawandel? Also geht weg von den sehr abstrakten Daten hin ins Konkrete.
Welche Veränderungen gibt es denn jetzt gerade? Und du hast gerade schon über den Inhalt gesprochen. Warum ist gerade dieser zweite Teilbericht so wichtig?
Ja, du hast ja schon einen Punkt angesprochen. Rund 3 Milliarden Menschen auf der ganzen Welt sind sehr anfällig, heißt es in dem Bericht, was den Klimawandel angeht. Also doch eine ganze Menge. Und wir haben die Botschaften sehr, sehr deutlich gehört. Also ein dringender Appell an die Politik. Antonio Guterres in seinem Grußwort, der gesagt hat, dieser Klimabericht ist vielmehr so eine Art Atlas des menschlichen Leids. Also das sind doch sehr eindringliche, sehr pathetische Zitate, die daraufhin abzielen, dass jetzt schnell politisch gehandelt werden muss, um den Klimawandel so weit es geht zu begrenzen, damit er sich nicht besonders stark oder nicht in dieser Stärke auswirkt, wie es könnte, wenn das Gradziel deutlich verfehlt wird von Paris. Andererseits haben wir aber auch eine zweite Botschaft, die aus diesem Teilbericht ausgeht, und die heißt, es ist noch nicht zu spät. Also das ist das Umfeld, dass man jetzt nicht hier resigniert vor einer Klimakatastrophe, die sich auf dem Weg macht, sondern dass es Möglichkeiten gibt, diese zu verlangsamen und somit viel aufzuhalten, was Zerstörung von Natur zum Beispiel angeht in der Zukunft. Deswegen ist dieser Teil doch sehr, sehr wichtig. Es gibt die Zusammenfassung für Politiker und ich kann mir gut vorstellen, dass dieser Teil sehr, sehr, sehr aufmerksam durchgelesen wird.
Wir wollen natürlich auch gleich auf diesen konstruktiven Aspekt, den du gerade angesprochen hast, auch noch mal schauen, auf die Chancen. Das ist ja schon mal ein guter Ausblick. Zunächst aber mal der Klimawandel, der ist da der menschengemachte. Welche Folgen hat er denn jetzt schon? Woran zeigt er sich und wie verletzlich sind wir denn auch alle als Weltbevölkerung da schon dadurch geworden?
Im Grunde haben wir viel über die letzten Jahre schon miterlebt, auch in Deutschland, auch in Bayern. Also ich erinnere mich vor ein paar Jahren an die doch sehr drastische Hitzeperiode, die dann auch wahnsinnige Kosten verursacht hat. Im Gesundheitssystem einerseits, andererseits zum Beispiel auch in der Landwirtschaft, dass die Dürre dort für Ernteausfälle gesorgt hat. Wir hatten die Überschwemmungen in Rheinland-Pfalz, in Nordrhein-Westfalen. Wir hatten auch immer wieder mit Hitzeperioden in Städten zu tun, die sehr auf die Gesundheit der Menschen abzielen. Und diese Risiken, die werden auch nochmal ganz klar benannt in diesem Bericht. Im Grunde die 4 Faktoren. Erstens Hitze und die Auswirkungen auf die Gesundheit der Menschen und die Gesundheit der Ökosysteme. Also wir müssen uns laut diesem Bericht, wenn der Klimawandel nicht besonders bekämpft wird, also wenn er sehr drastisch wird, uns an über 35 Grad Tage im Jahr gewöhnen. Es werden mehr werden. Das betrifft natürlich die vulnerablen Gruppen, ältere Menschen, Kinder aber auch und natürlich Menschen mit Vorerkrankungen, das ganz besonders in den Städten. Hinzu kommt aber auch das damit verbunden mit dieser starken Hitze. Zweitens, der Risikofaktor Dürre einhergeht. Ich habe es ja gerade genannt. Es kann zu Ernteausfällen kommen und das kostet natürlich ungemein viel auf der gesamten Gesellschaft. Und dann haben wir das Thema Wasser. Es kommt zu Wasserknappheit, so die Prognosen in dem Klimabericht. Das bedeutet dann natürlich auch, dass Wasser teurer werden wird. Und der 4. Teil, der damit noch zusammenhängt, das betrifft dann vor allem die Küstenregionen in der ganzen Welt, also nicht nur in Europa, sondern auch in der ganzen Welt. Die sind sehr bedroht von Hochwasser, von einem steigenden Meeresspiegel. Also das sind die 4 Risikofaktoren, die da sind. Aber diese können noch, es hieß einmal Das Zeitfenster ist da, aber es ist sehr knapp und es kann sich sehr, sehr schnell schließen. Es ist möglich, diese Veränderungen einigermaßen auszuhalten.
Schauen wir doch mal an. Du hast gerade einige der Sachen angesprochen. Extremwetterereignisse, sagen wir mal Naturkatastrophen natürlich. Die Folgen haben wir eben zuletzt letztes Jahr auch in Deutschland bemerkt, wie du gesagt hast. Die soziale Frage, die du auch schon angesprochen hast. Die Frage nach Ressourcen, auch die Frage nach, welche Teile des Landes sind überhaupt noch bewohnbar, welche sind überhaupt noch bewirtschaftbar. Welche Schlüsse kann denn jetzt die Politik aus diesem zweiten Teil des Berichts des Weltklimarats ziehen?
Dass sie vor allem sehr schnell handeln muss. Also wir haben es immer wieder gehört, egal wer gesprochen hat auf dieser Pressekonferenz, immer wieder der eindringliche Appell, ab heute spätestens ist jede Entscheidung, kann uns einer Klimakatastrophe näher führen oder wieder weiter weg. Und das sind jetzt die Entscheidungen, die in der Politik getroffen werden müssen. Natürlich nicht nur hier in Deutschland, natürlich in der gesamten Welt, aber einzelne Länder, und das ist angeklungen in der Pressekonferenz, die können natürlich als Vorbild dienen, dort schnellere Maßnahmen zu ergreifen. Zum Beispiel klimaeffizienteres Bauen, dass die Städte immer wieder so mit mehr Parks ausgestattet werden. Also eine Art grüne Lunge, die in den Städten entsteht. Weniger Flächenverbrauch, weniger Flächenversiegelung, mehr nachhaltige Landwirtschaft wurde auch genannt. Also es gibt Mittel und Wege, wie man sogar relativ schnell einigermaßen den Klimawandel hier oder die Auswirkungen des Klimawandels einbremsen kann. Da ist aber die Politik eben jetzt gefordert, schnell zu handeln und vor allem sehr beherzt auch zu handeln. Denn die Maßnahmen, die jetzt ergriffen werden, die müssen eigentlich ab sofort dann auch wirken, weil dieses Zeitfenster eben relativ knapp ist. Das könnte sich jeden Moment schließen und dann könnte es bei vielen Sachen auch zu spät sein. Wir haben es auch gehört, es sind wahnsinnig viele Arten, auch vor allem auf dem Land, bedroht. Allein wenn man das 1,5 Grad Ziel zwar erreicht, selbst dann sind rund 14 bis 15% der an Land lebenden Arten bedroht. So im Klimabericht, wenn dieses Ziel deutlich gerissen wird, es Richtung 3% Klimaerwärmung geht, 3 Grad Klimaerwärmung geht, dann ist es sogar so, dass rund 30% der Arten, die auf dem Land leben, sind.
Das heißt, wenn ich dich auch jetzt richtig verstehe und auch die Präsentation, die wir da gerade gehört haben, das sind ja wirklich die ganz großen Maßnahmen. Das ist etwas, was gesamtgesellschaftlich eigentlich stattfinden muss. Da geht es jetzt nicht darum, ob man selber jetzt mit dem Jutebeutel zum Einkaufen geht und weniger Auto fährt und den Flieger nicht mehr besteigt.
So ist es. Es geht um die großen Linien, aber es wird eben auch genannt, auch die kleinen Sachen für jeden Einzelnen. Weniger fliegen, mehr Zug fahren, mehr Fahrrad fahren, weniger Autofahren. Diese Sachen kommen da genauso vor. Ein großer Punkt, der da auch genannt worden ist, ein wichtiger Punkt ist, der im Klimabericht so drin steht, weniger Fleisch essen, mehr auf natürliche Produkte achten. Also quasi wie ich selber gesunder leben kann, so gesünder ist dann auch der Planet. Das ist die Botschaft, die auch ausgeht.
Dann schauen wir doch jetzt mal voraus, eben viele Risiken, aber eben auch einige Chancen. Welche Chancen haben wir denn hier noch auch als Weltbevölkerung alle zusammen, den Klimawandel zumindest abzumildern?
Es klingt natürlich alles immer so ein bisschen mit der rosaroten Brille. Wir als Weltbevölkerung, wir alle irgendwie zusammen. Das hören wir ja immer wieder. Und immer wieder kommt ja auch die Kritik. Was hilft es denn, wenn ein Land versucht, voll auf regenerative Energien wie eben Deutschland zu setzen, wenn andere nicht mitziehen? Aber das ist die große Frage, wenn man es umdreht. Naja, wenn niemand macht, dann ist dann auch niemandem geholfen. Gleichzeitig ein wichtiger Punkt, der hier vorgekommen ist, ist eben die soziale Frage. Und daran müssen alle Staaten eigentlich Interesse haben, den sozialen Frieden, den sozialen Zusammenhalt zu wahren. Denn der Klimawandel würde diese Ungleichheiten so im Bericht deutlich beschleunigen. Menschen, ich würde es mal salopp formulieren, Menschen mit viel Geld, die kommen besser mit den Veränderungen klar als die mit weniger Geld. Und deswegen diese zwei Botschaften, einerseits die Biodiversität, Ökosysteme robuster zu machen, dass sie sich besser an den Klimawandel anpassen können, aber eben auch die Gesellschaft robuster zu machen für den Klimawandel. Also dass der Klimawandel eigentlich auch zu einer Gerechtigkeitsfrage wird und dort einen großen Einfluss spielen muss, dass das unmittelbar miteinander zusammenhängt.
Wir haben jetzt gerade die Vorstellung des zweiten Teils dieses Berichts gesehen. Du hast es auch schon angesprochen. Weiß man denn schon, um welchen Aspekt geht es denn dann im dritten Teil?
Der dritte Teil, der wird im April vorgestellt. Da geht es vor allem um dann die technologischen und dann auch ökonomischen Auswirkungen und dann wahrscheinlich auch wieder die Lösungen daraus. Also wir sehen, dass das sehr konstruktiv alles angelegt ist, dieser Klimabericht, bei aller Katastrophe und aller Schwarzmalerei, die man natürlich dabei hat, weil die Daten das eben so zeigen, dass der Klimawandel letzten Endes dann doch die große Menschheitsherausforderung ist. Es gibt Lösungen, dass man das eben ausbremsen kann, dass man die einzelnen Spezien dann auch retten kann, dass kein großes Artensterben passieren wird. Aber dazu muss eben Gesellschaft, Wirtschaft, Politik und auch der Einzelne jede Menge beitragen. Und das wird im dritten Teil eine große Rolle spielen, was Technik, Wirtschaft und dann auch die politischen Handlungsempfehlungen angeht. Wobei ich auch dazu sagen muss, die politischen Handlungsempfehlungen, die sind heute genauso da, die waren beim ersten Teil auch da. Denn, wie gesagt, ich kann es noch mal erwähnen, das Zeitfenster schließt sich.
Dann noch mal zum Schluss jetzt ein kurzer Exkurs. Das große Nachrichtenthema der letzten Tage hat auch was mit dem Klimawandel zu tun, nämlich der Krieg in der Ukraine. Viele Userinnen und User haben jetzt hier auch drunter geschrieben, dass eigentlich das ja das Thema ist. Aber Rüdiger Pischel zum Beispiel, der hat geschrieben, der Ukraine-Krieg wird die Bemühungen um Jahre zurückwerfen. Es geht ja jetzt auch immer wieder auch um die Energieversorgung, um Erdgas, Erdöl. Wie ist das denn? Wie ist das einzuschätzen? Der Ukraine-Krieg, welche Bedeutung wird der für die internationale Klimapolitik haben?
Er wird eine sehr große Bedeutung haben. Und wenn wir das große Bild mal versuchen zu zeichnen, ja, das ist jetzt aktuell das bestimmende Thema. Aber es hieß eben jetzt auch, wir müssen schnell handeln und zwar ab heute, ab sofort. Und ein Krieg, der internationale Unsicherheiten hervorruft, geopolitische Unsicherheiten hervorruft, der sorgt natürlich dann ganz, ganz stark dafür, dass es in dieser Frage Klimaverhandlungen natürlich dann auch ein Riesenproblem gibt. Wenn das nicht ganz klar wird, dann werden wir da auf Dauer große Probleme haben, wenn dieser Konflikt nicht gelöst ist. Wie funktioniert das vor allem mit diesem großen Land Russland, mit den Klimaverhandlungen, wenn internationale Vereinbarungen nichts mehr wert sind?
Dankeschön. Tobias Beetz, unser BR-Reporter aus der Redaktion Landwirtschaft und Umwelt. Danke für deine Einschätzung. Und das war dieses BR24live. Wir haben natürlich noch einmal die wichtigsten Inhalte aus diesem Bericht des Weltklimarats für euch zusammengefasst auf br24.de und in unserer App. Und wir melden uns später noch einmal mit einem Update eben auch zur Ukraine. Ihr habt es gerade schon gehört. Dankeschön für den Moment fürs Zuschauen und bis später.